We do have our speakers here as a panel. There's a couple of microphones that we'll pass around here. When it comes to asking a question, this is slightly kind of old or low tech, I suppose, or lo-fi. We're going to have to come up to the microphone. So it's a little bit like, an altar call in some ways. The altar is here, and you're being called up to ask your question. So think of yourself a bit like Abraham. No, I just leave it there. But yeah, don't take no for an answer. Don't take any nonsense from the speakers. Don't let them flannel you. That's what I'm trying to say. So I'm looking around. I got used to kind of looking at people's faces and whether they're expressing actually genuine interest in asking a question. I won't just ask you just yet. I'll kick it off by warming it up and asking a couple of questions, throwing out a couple of questions, and then also if panelists want to develop that. And while you're talking, I will be looking out for hands to go up or little kind of signs, whatever it is you want to make. I'm just going to a few points. I'll just throw them out, and you panelists can deal with them as they wish. I was thinking a little bit in no particular order here. Jonathan Weinball had this thing about Abraham. At one point, I think you said that Abraham is understood by Paul as congruous, or his faith as congruous, in a way that for the rest of us it's all about incongruity. Incongruity was a kind of, mostly what we heard today. But at one point I thought I heard you say, but Abraham is somehow congruous. So therefore, if he's paradigmatic for faith, is there a place for congruent merit? I mean, the old medieval distinction between condign merit and congruent merit. Condign really bad. That's unacceptable. Congruent, well, let's argue about that. Sorry to put you on the spot, but
did
I hear you right? Did I hear you right?
I mean, it's possible I said that. I sort of hope I didn't.
Right, okay,
but I may have.
Well, it may have been me. I don't know. I just thought it was interesting.
So, I mean, I definitely did stress that there was a tradition of reading the Abraham narrative that sees Abraham's calling, Abraham's righteousness, the promise that he'll be the father of many nations, as an instance of congruous grace. There's a diverse tradition of why Abraham is a fitting recipient that you see in Philo and Josephus and Jubilees and the Book of Biblical Antiquities, lots of texts. But what they have in common is there's something about Abraham that makes him a fitting recipient of the grace he receives. I think actually what stands out in Paul is Paul seems to notice what those same texts notice, that Genesis 12 doesn't explain why God chooses Abraham. You go from the Tower of Babel account to a little genealogy, and then God calls Abraham. But the text is silent about why Abraham as opposed to someone else. Most other readers of that hear the silence as a silence that requires an explanation. And so you get traditions of backstories about Abraham that renders the grace congruous. What Paul does, I think, is hears the silence as speaking very significantly and says, if the text doesn't say why God chose Abraham, then the answer to why God chose Abraham is not there's something particular about Abraham, but God is this kind of God.
So not even his God's foreseeing Abraham's faith. You don't think that's implied at all in Romans 4, that there's something about Abraham's faith that God foresees, or as Arminius would tell us, or some Lutherans would have a version of that, would say that it's to do with, it's not that faith is a virtue, but nevertheless God needs to know what he's going to work with, and he comes to Abraham who responds.
Yep. I mean, there's again a tradition. So Philo's really interesting. Philo finds that there's several instances in the Pentateuchal narrative where characters receive grace before the text tells you why they're a fitting recipient. And in most of these cases, Philo can say, well, the text gives us a hint because their names are significant. So Noah finds favor before it says that Noah does what's right in the eyes of God. Philo says that's the wrong order, but Noah means rest or righteousness, so that's why. Isaac is chosen. Well, that's joy, that's laughter, that's a virtue. He gets to Jacob, and he sort of says, this name explanation's not going to work, because you don't really get given a gift because you're good at holding onto your brother's heel. What am I going to do? And he says in that case, God chose, or God disposed grace based on God's foreknowledge of Jacob's more virtuous life than Esau. We could ask questions about that reading of that narrative if we wanted, but it's interesting that Paul in Romans 9 precisely doesn't do that. He says, before the twins who were conceived by the same sexual act, before they had done anything good or bad, in order that God's promise and election might stand, God says the older will serve the younger, also subverting the kind of ordinary social system of status. And then he says, is there injustice with God? And you think he's going to explain no, because there's actually this about, but he responds, no, God will have mercy on whom he has mercy, and he'll have compassion on whom he has compassion. So it seems to me that Paul, when read with his interpretive tradition, seems to go out of his way to exclude every possible humanly ascribable or achievable explanation for why the recipient of grace is worthy to receive it, and says the answer is the call of God, the promise of God, the mercy of God, the grace of God. It's a bit uncontrollable and unpredictable,
Sure.
but it can be trusted because it's the God of this grace.
Right. And if I can move from the kind of sort of initiation or beginnings of faith to the question of the content of the Christian life, John, you had this thing at one point, it wasn't a major part, but you did say something about the Romans 7, Romans 8 thing, whereby you said that Romans 8 is about the Christian life, Romans 7 is sort of pre-Christian or natural Adam. Does it not just come down to the same thing at the end of the day, no matter which way you take that? You just say that in as much as we're Christians, this Romans 8 is right, but in as much as we're natural people, Romans 7 is a condition. So, you're right, it's not the Christian experience in Romans 7, but it's an experience that Christians would still know because they remain natural for at least 50% of the time, or maybe more. I just wondered what you thought.
Yes, I mean, I've been thinking about that as I've been hearing the papers today. I just think that the text itself doesn't encourage that kind of in as much as you are. The way Paul portrays it in Romans 7, 5-6 is, this is what you once were, this is what you, but now, as Romans 7, 6 begins. So, there's a sequential relationship, it seems to me, between Romans 7 and Romans 8. Now, you could say that in another sense, Romans 7 remains true of everyone in as much as they don't abide in Christ, or something like that. I'm open to that as a kind of secondary level of reading of the text. It seems to me we have to be, I've always had a passion for kind of being honest with the text and not trying to squeeze it into something that we would like it to be. And it seems we have to be clear about what the text is actually saying. And then you might say, as a second kind of hermeneutical level, and you might go to Galatians 5, the flesh desires against the spirit and the spirit against the flesh. So you might go to some other Pauline verses and think, well, maybe there is a dialectic and not just a sequential from one situation to another. But I think myself, as I was kind of reading of Romans 7 to 8, I'm not sure you can get that dialectic directly out of there.
Right.
But Stephen has contrary views, of course.
Well, not entirely. I mean, I read Romans 7 and Romans 8 as sequential as well. But I guess what I would say in the tradition is if you read Romans 7 as about the Christian life and the struggle with sin in the Christian life, you still have to read that in concert with Romans 8 in some way. Right. So I don't know that you necessarily immediately, if you adopt that reading, even though I think it's not correct, I'm not sure that you immediately have to fall into dichotomizing the experience of the struggle with sin. But the reason I do think it's, one of the big reasons that I and lots of other people have thought that it is sequential is that if you look at the description of the struggle with sin in Romans 7, the Holy Spirit is never mentioned. Whereas in Romans 8, in Galatians, the Spirit is central to that struggle. And so, I think you can have an account of that struggle with sin that is understanding it as a struggle that is in which the Christian is empowered by the Spirit, and that that retains the kind of sense, I think, of ongoing warfare that interpreters have been trying to capture when they've focused on Romans 7 as a kind of account of the Christian life.
Yeah, well, thank you. And just one last. I'm still looking to see if people are going to ask some questions on for their own back, but who? Anytime you like, anytime. Just put your hand up so that I know that you're really keen. Okay, I'm going to. Yeah, he's desperate. Well, I'm going to ask one more just so that. So one last thing that I'm going to say, and then I will be silent from that point onwards. And that's simply that both in Barbara's paper and I think also in James's, there was a kind of a sense that, and I may be picking this up wrongly, that John was kind of, Johannine literature was coming in and sort of pushing Paul a little bit to the side as if to say, let me take over here. We're going to live the Christian life. We have to have a more participative idea, slightly more mystical idea, if you want to call it that. There needs to be something a little bit more sophisticated than what Paul's got to offer, and that Wesley and our friend Frank thought that too. One also thinks of people like Osiander, I think, in the following generation in Reformation times. Is that fair? There's a thesis by a guy called Patrick Ball, where he came out recently, a couple of years ago, where he talks about the Reformation time, the kind of the tension between John and Paul and who gets the priority. But I think in these cases, it seemed like John perhaps takes over.
So I think that both James and my paper is a question of the kind of sources that we had. Like if Sebastian Frank had written a commentary on Pauline text, I could have used that. But these people, and like the vast majority of the tradition, don't necessarily distinguish. They read the Bible fully and intertextually. And so one thing, so there's definitely a lot of John going on and everything else. 1 John, very popular too. But one thing that occurred to me for some of my other panelists was I'd be curious to know how you think about the task of New Testament theology, biblical theology, when we now have a better understanding of Paul's theology and Paul's grace, but how does that speak then to other parts of the biblical witness, so in a theological way. So I'm very comfortable kind of, just digging around and pulling out things out of Frank like this, but it's really hard. So, but it was also interesting to read in light of these perspectives about the inwardness, and everybody cited Galatians 2:20, I guess.
Yeah, I think on the Johannine issue, I think it's true. It's kind of anachronistic in a sense to try and say, because Wesley wouldn't have thought that way. He tried to read Scripture as a whole, but it's sort of an analyzing and looking and saying, is he kind of reading Paul through John in some sense? And that's what people are suggesting. Not that he would see any tension between them, but that he's maybe reading Paul somewhat through First Johannine eyes.
Great. So we do have a question. Joshua, so you come up and use the mic, thanks.
This is a question for Dr. Barclay, and I'm very grateful for your visit and the surprising ending of the lecture in the hot button issue of the day was stimulating. And I have a question about what you say with reference to the national deity and the daemonion of 1 Corinthians 10, which, as a believer, I want to run from that. But I also, by analogy, wish to ask you, if grace is everywhere in Second Temple Judaism, but grace is not everywhere the same, might it not also be true that Christian nationalism is everywhere, but not everywhere the same? And for example, this past March in Papua New Guinea, it was announced that Papua New Guinea is now officially a Christian nation, where the state acknowledged that all the rights and authorities and powers come from God, the Holy Trinity, and that this Christian faith, as a reflection of the heritage of the people, enables religious freedom. On the other hand, in other contexts, Christian nationalism seems to be like a slur, a real pejorative label, almost an indication of one's bigotry. And in this context, not Wycliffe, but in Toronto, it's often applied to Christians who are just trying to do good, maybe make an influence of salt and light. And so might your taxonomy about perfections be applied to this subject? And the ancillary question is, when we say Jesus is the king of the rulers of the earth, we want to acknowledge, on the one hand, Christ's faith as the only good that matters. But how do we also recognize that there are threats in the world, Christians under persecution in Nigeria running from Islam, and where a Christian state might protect that border in the same way that a Jewish state protects a minority population. And so you can probably see where I'm going with it. I'm just asking for a bit more definition. What do you mean by this word? And recognizing that is the question that I think everyone is trying to understand.
Thank you very much. That's a very helpful question. Yes, I totally agree with you that the label Christian nationalism can cover a lot of different things. And sometimes, as you say, it's about saying there's a Christian heritage, there's a Christian traditions, there are Christian values, and we want to uphold those. Of course, Christians can differ about what those values are that they want to uphold, and that can be interpreted in a kind of exclusive way. Therefore, if you hold any other traditions, get out of here. Or it could be interpreted in a more pluralist, sort of tolerant way. Well, this is what we hold, but we want to find space for people to act differently. Obviously, tolerance was an important feature of the Enlightenment, which itself has some Christian origins. So there's vast areas of what you could things about Christian nationalism that I wasn't able to go into, and the whole theology of church and state is a massive topic. The one point of it I was trying to, and it's an important one, but it's not by no means the whole of this. But the one point I was trying to insist on is we have to be very careful that we don't coalesce, combine, or merge our sense of patriotism and citizenship with our belonging to Christ. And as soon as those two things become merged, and it's easy for them to merge because, of course, the politicians want religious backing, and the religion wants political backing. So these things easily, become sort of coalesce. But Christian nationalism takes different shapes. I mentioned it in Russia, and as you may know, there was a very powerful statement about Ruski Mir theology by Orthodox Christians in America, internationally, which echoed the Barmen Declaration in criticizing Ruski Mir theology. So there's a Russian form, there's Eastern Europe, there's different forms, and I don't know enough about Papua New Guinea, but I'd love to learn more about that. And some are more pernicious than others. I absolutely get that. It depends what's unpackaged. But what worries me is where you have a rally like we had in London, strongly anti-immigrant. Elon Musk was zoomed in, hugely anti-Islam, and people waving the flags everywhere. Flags have gone out everywhere, and people carrying crosses. As if to say, because this is a Christian country, you Muslims get out of here. And that kind of coalescence of Christian symbolism and national symbolism really sends a shiver down my spine. Yeah.
Anybody else want to comment on that in the panel? Otherwise, I'm looking for another question. Don't know what Russia was. Yeah. Professor Jarvis, if you don't mind coming forward.
a very rich and wonderful opportunity to hear about different ways of understanding grace. And sorry, I'm not crying, it's just my voice I've had a cold. I'm a priest at a local church, and it's a progressive church, and I would love to be able to preach grace in a way that could be heard. And I find it difficult because it's filled with activists, people who want to change the world, and hallelujah for that, and take care of the homeless, and et cetera, et cetera. But I'd like to be able to communicate the power of understanding our lives as rooted and grounded entirely in God's initiative, and that continues throughout our life. So I would just like some advice about how to preach grace in a context like that, and that may be also relevant to contexts where people have heard about grace a lot, and it just goes over their heads. So I'm just asking for some, how do we translate the wonderful stuff that we've been able to think about and that we're privileged to think about to people who have such a different understanding of who they are as autonomous humans, and what the job of a Christian is, and what the resource, where is the Christian life sourced? How do we talk about, I try to, but how do you talk about living in Christ and from Christ in a way that can communicate and be transformative, if you have any ideas?
Thank you.
I'll pass this over as other people have thoughts, but I think it's a wonderful question, and thank you. And I just say, if we don't ask questions like that, I actually don't think we're really doing theology all the way. I think we're just kind of playing with words sometimes. So thank you for making sure that's on the table. I'll say one thing that's been really helpful about thinking about grace with John and the expansion of the category of works to the category of worth is I do think it's made the experience of banking on, relying on, anchoring our value, our worth, our enoughness, our belovedness in something other than God's love and grace in Jesus. It maps onto and it makes sense of a wider range of experiences. So not probably too many of us go around just by default thinking the observance of certain aspects of the law given through Moses to the people of Israel is the basis for my being enough or being loved by God. Maybe some of us do in some settings, and that's certainly an experience in some Christian settings. But I think most of us go around thinking by default that whether I am enough, whether I could be, ever will be loved, is in some sense, the weight of that question is carried by something about me. Right? We think our biographies carry the burden of our being loved. Maybe it's our genealogy and our family tree. Maybe it's where we got our education. Maybe it's the size of our bank account or the job we have. Maybe it's the good we've been able to do. Maybe it's fill in the blank. But we have 10 million ways of measuring our value and just assuming that the value of and the verdict on our life is made up of the sum and substance of our life. And I just think the reality of grace both is in touch with that, and I think this is part of its mercy, is that it compassionately diagnoses that tendency. It sort of knows us in that experience of carrying the weight of our own worth. But then it also announces a good news that takes the weight off of our shoulders as it's carried by the one who said, "Come unto me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest." And to me, the power of grace is it lets us ask that deep and fundamental question: does anyone love me? Could anyone, if they actually knew me, love me? We can ask that question, and instead of being turned to ourselves and our own resources, we follow the finger of John the Baptist and we hear, "Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world." And yet amazingly and mercifully, as we look away from ourselves, what we find is that God looking right back at us. And because of the Son, God says to us what God has always said to the Son. You are my beloved daughter. You are my beloved son. In you I am well pleased. And preaching that in the pain of everyday life, I think, is what we're called to do. So.
I think you're also talking about kind of a church context which is full of activism, but sometimes loses its ground in the gospel, in the process. You're an Anglican priest, and so for you, and I'm an Anglican, and it's an Anglican institution, so I can say, for me, the regular practice of the Eucharist is where I'm grounded again and again in the gift of Christ that is the reason for anything that I do. In other words, the weekly gathering of the community is our raison d'etre. It brings us back to our raison d'etre. But I do think it's very helpful to think of other ways in which activism is surrounded by prayer, is grounded in prayer, because I sometimes think Christian activists practically blend into everybody else. Like, well, you might as well be anything. I mean, you're on the same cause as lots of other people. What is it Christian about this? And we can, of course, make alliances with all kinds of people who don't come from a Christian background, but or from Christian convictions. But unless we are grounded in the distinctiveness of the Christian reasons for doing what we're doing, whatever the campaign or whatever it is. I mean, there's a big campaign in the UK at the moment, just to take one example, of abolishing a cap on benefits for families who have. If you have more than 2 children, you don't get any more benefits. That if you might have 5, or you might have 2, but it's the same. You only get for 2, and so there's a big campaign like we've got to abolish this. This is really punishing children in poverty. But it's like, I'm happy to join that campaign, but let's keep thinking about why we're in that campaign. What is it about child poverty that grossly offends us in the gospel? Do you see what I mean? And I learned a lot from the Iona community in Scotland, who had that combination of spirituality, prayer, song, worship, reflection, and working on all kinds of social issues. But they didn't let one, in my experience, crowd out the other. So I think we need habits. The Eucharist is one, and the others were habits that keep drawing us back to the essential truths of the gospel, which is why we care about this or that other social or political issue. But.
Yeah, I'm not. Your question touches on something that I felt a bit convicted about as I was preparing my response to John's paper, which is, in our cultural context, one of the worst things we can do is to question something about somebody else's identity rather than affirm it. Culturally, that's not very acceptable in our world. And grace at a popular level, it tends to get understood as simply about affirmation. As somebody who teaches New Testament, I have the repeated experience of meeting people, and they ask me what I do, and I say, and sometimes people will say, I have real difficulty with Paul, but I love Jesus in the Gospels. He's so accepting of everybody, and I have to bite my lip because I want to say, have you read the Gospels? But I think Jesus in the Gospels is a little more complicated in the way he relates to people than that. But there's that powerful sense in our culture that if we talk about grace, we're simply talking about affirming who people are. But of course, rightly understood, grace affirms our importance to God, but it also says important things about our unworthiness. And the way in which I was kind of a little bit convicted about this was, if we're going to present grace in that biblical way to people, we do, I think, need to be at least able to show the way in which grace has not affirmed everything about who we are, but has also called us to question our identity and our commitments, so that at least we're not in the position that we're always saying to other people, there's something the gospel's going to call into question about you, but it's not going to call into question anything about me. And that kind of convicted me a little bit as I was preparing the response.
I would just add briefly to those excellent answers. One of the problems with communicating grace in this culture is people don't know how to talk about sin. So, and that is a real challenge, because I think, most people in downtown Toronto, if you mention sin, probably what it would elicit is a smirk, rather than any serious thing, right? So, but I think, connecting to what you're just saying, there is this desire for authenticity, which itself is full of all sorts of contradictions, but it's there, okay? Something to work with. And there is also, I think, as part of that, a recognition of brokenness. And that can be a point at which we can connect, and showing our own brokenness, and also exploring that in others, I think.
Okay, Barbara?
Yeah, thank you, everyone, for your answers too, and the question. I mean, I guess I'll just say practically, if you were on the lectionary, then make sure to just address the epistles if they're assigned and preach on those. The Gospels are kind of sometimes run away, but expanding the idea, like thinking about what's the problem. And in the kind of community that you described, a lot of people could relate to brokenness and the brokenness around them, and the brokenness that they also feel great sadness over in themselves. And to think maybe a little bit the way that John Lindenbaugh also extended our notion of grace beyond redemption and personal salvation, but to the healing of the world. That can help activists both see how they are being Christ in the world and having Christ formed in them, and that it distinguishes it from normal action in the world and good justice. So.
Well, thank you all. I didn't know that I would really like Pauline scholars, people who do things with New Testament. Does extending the idea of work to worth take us very far? If we are still framing the conversation of grace and worth and work with the language of precedence and subsequence, isn't it better, for example, to think of them as a dyad, both emanating from God, grace, Christ is the one who produces this good work. And to quote Ephesians, is it possible in Paul's possible world that Ephesians 2:10 will come first before we have Ephesians 2:8? For by grace we've been saved through faith, but if we start with 10, for he really created us to do good works. It's not an addendum, it is really what is part. Is it possible to see this as a dyad, rather than to think of it in terms of precedence and subsequence?
Well, I guess even in that verse, he has created you for. You're God's poema, I think is the Greek. Already suggests that the good works are emerge out of and express and reflect God's action. We don't make ourselves. So it seems to me sequence might be the wrong word, like first God acts and then we act, as if it's a sort of relay race. You know, God runs the first lap and then passes the baton on to us, and then it's over to us. I think sequence may be, you know, but priority in the sense of the only ground on which we can stand, the only air we can breathe, the only condition of possibility for doing the good works, to give the shorthand there, is that God has brought us into being and brought our works into being. You know, in other words, it's that sort of constant sense, like as soon as I think it's like it's my good works, if I've lost the sense of dependence that is integral to Christian existence, then I've lost the essence of who I am.
Yeah, I'm glad you referenced that verse in Ephesians. Calvin says about that verse, works themselves are a part of grace. And I think that's kind of expressing a similar sense to the one John's just expressed. The crucial thing here is the sense of dependence. That the works themselves are not. There's maybe a sequence as we experience it, but I can see what you're getting at. It's not that God acts and then our response is kind of an independent response to that divine act. It's rather that our response is enfolded within and empowered by what God has done, and that becomes the basis on which we're able to dwell within the gift, if you like.
Time for maybe squeeze two last questions in. So first of all, thank you.
Thank you all for your wonderful presentations today. I have a question for Jonathan. You know, in your paper, you helpfully outlined that incongruous grace, you see it in the past, present, and also future. And there's a move to seeing this grace as a sort of universal grace. But at the same time, I couldn't help but think that the examples, the chapters you focused on, say Romans 4 and Romans 5, Abraham and Adam, they're not necessarily two random figures in the Bible, but rather very foundational figures for the beginning of humanity and for the beginning of a people. And so I wonder if Paul's discussion of incongruous grace, when he's talking about incongruous grace, it's particularized to the creation of a people, a new people, joining the people of God, as opposed to necessarily the only way to understand grace, let's say in the whole New Testament, is as incongruous grace. And if we particularize it to the creation of a new people with Abraham or with Adam, I'm just wondering if it might allow the possibility of seeing other forms of grace in the New Testament, like, let's say, Matthew, the father who sees what you do in secret will reward you. Just wondering.
No, I really appreciate the question. I hadn't thought about it in precisely those terms, so it helps me give a category to think some of these passages through with. I think you're absolutely right that these are not arbitrary figures. You have an Adam-Christ contrast. I think Paul's reading the Abraham story because there's something sort of both programmatic and paradigmatic. The way Israel's story starts says something about the substance and the shape of Israel's story. So not random figures, very particular. I do think it's telling that the way Paul, for example, tells his own biography seems marked by the same pattern of grace that called Abraham and Israel into being. So he'll say, I was advancing in Judaism beyond many of my own age, but when the God who set me apart before my birth, from my mother's womb, called me in grace, this kind of thing. So there's a kind of before and after that's marked by incongruity in creative grace. That's true of Paul. When he says to the church in Corinth, consider your calling, not many of you are wise or strong or of noble birth. God calls that which is not to shame that which is, etc. There's incongruous grace at the birth of Paul's apostleship, the birth of the church. And then when he thinks about not just the past and the present in Romans 9 through 11, in the past he says Abraham was called into being this way. Israel in their wanderings in the wilderness was carried this way. In the idolatry of the golden calf, God says, I will have mercy on whom I have mercy. He figures what's happening through the Gentile mission with words from Hosea in Romans 9:24 following, and he figures it incongruously. Those who are not my people will be called my people. Those who are not loved will be called loved. And this is because Christ, the cornerstone, is the one in whom Gentiles have reached righteousness, but Israel has temporarily stumbled, not knowing that Christ is the end of the law for righteousness. So it's both past and present tense. But in Romans 11:11, to the end of the chapter, he turns to the future tense, and his hope for Israel is that precisely the way God has acted in the past, and God is acting in the present, will be the way God acts in the future. And so you might say his promise, his hope, is a kind of child of history. So there's something so significant about those Adamic, Abrahamic moments that Paul can say all Israel will be saved, not just as a fingers crossed, but because when there's disobedience and death, the God who did act and is acting to call into being that which is not, to raise the dead and to justify the ungodly, will fulfill his covenant, and this will be my covenant, I will take away their sins. Right? And then he sums it all up. God imprisoned all in disobedience in order that God might have mercy on all. So I don't want to say this is the only configuration of pattern in the New Testament. That would be a bigger question we could talk through. But I do think in Paul it's much more expansive as just the kind of Adamic and Abrahamic beginning. I think there's something in those beginnings that's paradigmatic of both Paul's experience of grace, Paul's Gentile mission, and Paul's hope for the world.
One last question. Yes, please.
Again, thank you all very much. It's been a wonderful time today. This is to all of you, whoever has thoughts and wants to have a comment on it. It seems today largely our talk of the incongruity of grace has probably pertained especially to the individual and grace for how the individual encounters that grace. I would just like to invite reflection ecclesiologically. How does the incongruity of grace relate to the church, to the salvation of the church, to the life of the church? Yeah, any way you'd like to take that. Thank you.
I mean, Paul didn't think it through individually or only individually. It seems to me, the reason why and how he founded communities that crossed ethnic distinctions, that crossed social boundaries, that crossed gender hierarchies and undermined gender hierarchies and so on. So it seems to me, I'm always trying to think about what is the social correlate of theology. Like what are the ways this is expressed, and what kind of patterns of life is this correlating with? And absolutely, in Paul, it's an ecclesiological phenomenon. It grounds revolutionary kind of communities that are unparalleled on the Roman landscape because they join together people both locally and internationally who would never otherwise have anything to do with each other. And it seems to me there's something about the conscious and explicit recognition of the church in its multiculturalism, in its multi-stranded, multi-status, gender-blind kind of patterns of life that are saying, yeah, we're only here, look, I'm only here not because I'm British or middle class or educated. I'm only here because of the gift of Christ, and so are you. And that's what binds us together across all of the things that in normal society would distinguish. So we should make a point of it as well, expressing grace in precisely the fact that we are deeply bound and express our common life with people totally unlike us in every other respect. And that's when we discover, oh, that's who I really am.
Just add one little thought, and I learned it from him, so it's not really my thought. But one of the things that happen, basically every culture has its criteria of worth, its symbolic capital, its tokens of value. And what, of course, they do is they become the basis on which we can divide between us and them, right? Those who have the value, those who don't, us and them. And what happens if a gift is given that totally disregards those criteria of worth or tokens of value, and it's given to the unworthy in the absence of worth? Well, then suddenly what's exposed is not that those differentials don't matter and our histories aren't real, but that there is a we that's deeper and more fundamental than every us and them. Right? And it's really striking that in Romans, Paul says 2 times there's no distinction. One in relation to sin, there's no distinction because all sinned and lack the glory of God. And in Romans 10, there's no distinction because all who call on the name of the Lord will be saved. And that all in that context is very much an all people, an across the Jew-Gentile divide. And as that's being worked out in Romans 14 against some kind of practice differences, cultural differences, dietary differences, calendar differences, Paul encourages them to each relate to each other as one for whom Christ died. Right? What you have in common is that you are each a recipient of a gift, not because you had the value or you didn't, but precisely because God gave incongruously to each. It creates an all that is deeper than our differences.
Anybody else want to respond to the ecclesiological aspect? If not, that perhaps gives, well, it's actually, well, there's more hands up, but actually time is just about up, but go on. Well, we're not like bound by slaves to the clock. So please, if you have a question.
Very brief question. So today you talked to us about how grace is given without condition. I mean, the giving part. But you haven't touched about whether there are conditions to receive from the recipient or criteria, the word that you just used. Because, the fact that it's freely given does not mean that the receiving automatically happens, or does it? Thank you.
I can answer for Sebastian Frank. You just have to let go and let God in. Because the whole thing is about letting God move through you. So just do it.
What would Calvin say?
And that's what faith is. Christ becomes our faith in us then. Yeah, that's it.
Yes, I mean, we've often got tied up on this because we think, well, faith is a condition. But faith, what Paul means by pistis, is trust in a promise. And as Luther said very clearly, faith is not a work in the sense that Paul is worried about works. Because faith is, in a sense, precisely not, oh, I've got to do something now. Faith is saying, I trust God that God is doing this. And I see it more as faith is elicited by God. It's not like God says X and then says, right, over to you. Are you gonna do something about this? It's like a call, and that's another important word that Paul uses, a call that draws from us a response. And so I don't think we can ever in a position to say, congratulations me, I believed in God, or I trusted in God. Yeah, that's the way I would see it. But
yeah, that's what I was trying to say about faith as an instrument. Faith is not itself any. I mean, do we have faith that the Maple Leafs will win the Stanley Cup? what is that worth, right? It depends what your faith is in. So we don't trust our own trust. We're trusting it's all externally, on God's promise. That would be a miracle. Very incongruous.